In this video, we're going to talk about lat training specifically and how to train the lats most effectively with only 2 exercises. Now, I'm going to show a couple variations early on in the video, and I'm going to go over the motions specifically on a screen recording here. But if you want other options and you are looking for other options just from the standpoint of you not having equipment that I have access to, I'm going to provide options and alternatives later on in the video that may allow you to more effectively choose what's appropriate for you in the context of you and your training in your gym. So diving right into it, with more vertical lat-based motions, what we have is basically a situation where we want to train motion of the arm and the shoulder blade in tandem together with elevation and depression, meaning like shrugging up and shrugging down. Now, the only difference between shrugging up and shrugging down in this particular instance with this kind of a pull down is simply the fact that the arm and the elbow are moving in the context of vertical lat motions when we're looking at bracing. Notice that I have a bench here. Notice that the loading is mostly vertical, but not totally over my head, right? So from the perspective of where the cable ends up, I can't really effectively load the bottom if the cable is directly above me, nor would I really want the cable above me from the perspective of actually loading the arm. So the best case scenario is really to have the cable slightly forward and angled up so that when you're at the top portion of the motion here, if I pause in that position, notice that the arm is actually angled up and kind of toward the eyes. And again, I'm allowing that arm to kind of shrug up and toward my face in a very controlled manner. This is not a rush thing. This is not a passive thing where you're relaxing in the top. You're sort of controlling yourself into that shrug and allowing your hand to kind of reach more and more toward the cable origin. Now, again, from the perspective of bracing, and I'll just let this play here, 2 major things are very important. The first thing is the opposite side hand and what it is doing. In this case, I'm actually pushing not only into the bench, but also sort of to my left in this case. So my left arm is almost pulling to the left so that I don't get rotated toward the left as the cable might have me. And my hip, from the perspective of the same side hip, right? So this right hip, it kind of wants to get pulled up and out of the seat. So what I'm doing to kind of resist that pull is I'm actually using my other leg to push the floor away from me just a little bit so I can actually sort of seat that hip down into the ground. Now, if any of you are super strong, you may actually find that the amount of load that you're using is just pulling you up and out of the seat, in which case I would advise, if you don't have access to a lat pull down, which we'll go over that variation in a second, what you can do is you can actually buy a seat belt from Amazon. It's like $10 or something, and just use a seat belt to hold you down. And if you and the bench are both getting pulled up, congrats, you're probably pretty strong, in which case you could just bring a dumbbell over to hold the bench down. So it's a lot of work, at least initially, but it's well worth it in terms of just the setup optimization and stuff like that. So I want to show a little bit of a different angle here from the back so we can get a better idea of just how to set this up appropriately. And again, notice that my hand is coming across and up my face, almost where my biceps are sort of kissing my eyes, my nose, and my mouth. And as I'm beginning to pull down, I'm not really thinking much about where my arm is going, because if I'm in the appropriate position from the stretch perspective, where my arm is going to be directed is exactly where it should be from the perspective of actually training those more vertical lats, again, because those vertical lats are going to pull you basically right down close to your hip. So again, first things first, that arm gets stretched up and across. Second things second, we want to make sure that we're controlling that shrug upward. And then third and last, we want to make sure that we really have some really solid restraints to push against, because again, this is a motion where, because you are doing it single arm, there are multiple force directions that you're getting pulled. It's not just a bilateral or double arm thing where you're getting pulled just in one direction mainly, and that you have to resist that one direction mainly again. So again, just going back to this first video for reiteration, opposite arm is super important. Again, the whole seatbelt thing I already went over. And then the arm is being stretched up and across the face. Now, some people in some pull downs find that they get a lot of recruitment going on in their biceps and their triceps. What I personally find is that usually the reason is because this forearm right here is not tracking directly in line with the line of pull of the cable. So if you film yourself and you're looking at yourself back on video and you notice that like your forearm is angled this way or angled this way, you'll get a lot more elbow recruitment, elbow muscle recruitment in that, as well as potentially some forearm stuff going on, when in reality, again, the main mover here should be those vertical lats. So in this first sort of alternative example, I am using a traditional lat pull down where we do have access to the thigh pad. And notice all of the themes in terms of the setup, the execution, the load direction, the arm path, all that stuff is exactly the same. Arm is being loaded up and sort of towards the chin. Opposite side hand is actually pushing to my left so that I'm not inclined to actually be rotated away from my working arm. And this bottom leg in this case, because I have have much more direct support, something to actually hold me down, is actually pushing up into the pad. So a lot of clients that I have who tend to get pulled up and out of the seat, maybe they're getting tired, maybe they're just forgetting to kind of cue themselves. The solution is not to like do a bunch of stuff with your trunk to how to try to hold your trunk down, because this is not inherently like, we're not training spinal extensors here. It's actually just to push through the floor like you're doing a calf raise harder up into this. And now again, you'll notice that I'm pretty scooted back here, right? So I would technically have more support if my hip were farther forward, where the pad was closer to my hip and to my spine. But in that case, I would have to kind of lean back. And again, I want that load direction not to be directly overhead. As I mentioned earlier, you do want it to still be kind of in front of you and your arm being pulled up and across your body, as is in the case here. Now, from the different perspective back from behind, much like I did with the other exercise, this gets maybe a little bit trickier and a little bit more precarious for some people. Again, I'm not going to repeat myself too much here, but arm gets pulled up and across toward the face, arm shrugs up under control at the same time, and you can't see it from this angle, but my right hand in this case, because now the working arm is my left arm, is actually pushing to the right against the pole so I don't get rotated. And again, flip-flop, there's the whole thigh support, leg support. Now my left leg is the thing that's under the pad, and my right leg, again, just to show the reason that I show this perspective, is actually hanging off the seat. Now, if you find that this is like just way too uncomfortable for you, you just can't seem to get the management down, what I would suggest is actually just is going with the bench variation, just because a lot of times, like if you personally can't find a comfortable position, it's not really worth just having a ton less stability. I personally find that you don't actually need as much support as you think, and there's basically no load here, or there's no real direction I'm getting pulled that I wouldn't want to be pulled in this example here, because again, I'm so focused on the restraint aspects of, again, in this case, pulling my arm to the right and really pushing up into this pad. Again, literally half of my ass is actually hanging off of the pad in this case. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll actually bring like a little stool over that's the height of the pad so that I can just sit on the stool, which is obviously a little bit more comfortable. You have most of your butt cheeks on the stool itself, but a lot of you probably will not have a perfect stool that's the height of your lat pull down, of your seated lat pull down. And so this is a great alternative, and it works, especially if you have access to a slightly wider seat that is comfortable for you. So again, just wanting to show the first angle one more time. Same side leg is pushing up into that pad, opposite side arm into that pole, and all the cues and everything else in regard to stretching and contracting that vertical lat are the same. So those were two options for the vertical lats, and now I want to get into some of the stuff for the horizontal lats. First thing is first, we want to conceptualize these the same from the perspective of we really want to encourage motion of the shoulder girdle, and in doing so, we want to encourage, in this case, a little bit more of that horizontal plane motion, i.e. that protraction, as opposed to the elevation depression type thing. So all of the principles here ultimately are the same, and you'll start to see things that are very, very familiar from that first exercise where, oh, guess what? Left arm in this case, pushing into the pad and actually kind of pulling the pad to my left here so that I stay in that working arm. And then right hip here, because this is more of like a rotational thing, there's not a ton of force that's actually pulling me upward. I'm actually pushing, if you can follow my mouse here, I'm pushing into this bench, almost abducting that left leg, so that when I push into that bench, I don't get turned. Right, so basically your best friend with any sort of lat-based motion, which is, predominantly the single arm stuff that I love the most for the reasons that should be obvious so far. Right? You can't stretch your arm across your body or across your body and above your head. Double arm, your hands just kind of run into each other. And so the biggest thing ends up being just, can you actually set up in a way where the restraints that you yourself, the supports that you yourself are creating, are appropriate for the load direction that you're trying to resist. And just to kind of show the alternative angle here, like I did with the other two exercises, again, my arm is getting pulled now mostly just across my body as opposed to above my head and across my body. And so my aim point personally is kind of like the high point of the sternum, almost like kind of toward my throat, right? The angle should be slightly high to low. I find that that's usually most comfortable, but essentially it's just the arm path that allows you to stretch your arm most across your body. And so people historically, I think, have really tried to discourage this shoulder blade scapular motion for whatever reason. And that's really, really ultimately going to be the key to actually stretching your lat and giving your lat advantage, because it's going to be the biggest mover of the shoulder girdle into extension as a whole, right? So meaning like in other words, if you are doing any kind of row or pull down, your lat is going to be the biggest mover of your shoulder girdle, whereas the rest of your tissues in the upper back don't really contribute to the shoulder girdle motion as a whole. So again, in this example, the hand is getting pulled across, right hand stabilizes me here, right leg stabilizes me here. And again, if I've really captured that full stretch position, I don't have to think too much about where I'm pulling. But if you have to cue anything for either variation, it's elbow down, right? It's not elbow back. A lot of times people who are just pulling back will mistakenly be pulling much wider than this. So as a whole, and you'll see in the last exercise here that I'm going to show, that the arm path ends up being very narrow if you just are thinking the words or thinking the intent of moving down with the arm as opposed to back. So that's really the horizontal variant that I have for the cable motion, and I want to show one more alternative for you all who actually have access to a chest supported machine like I do here. So I actually have a seat belt here, as you can see, to basically this was just something I was playing around with on this particular day, just to kind of hold my leg down even more, but it's not a necessary thing by any means, especially with this setup. So all the principles as far as the things that we just went over are exactly the same, much as in the first couple of variations, right? Notice that these joint angles, the arm getting pulled across the body, the opposite side leg, the opposite side arm pushing against this support. You know, my chest in this case is like really pushed against, you can't even barely see it now, right? This chest pad right here, my chest is being smushed against that, and I'm almost actually pushing myself into it. And then beyond that, everything else is the same. This is just simply a chest supported row with all of the exact same sorts of intents, both from the perspective of stabilizing myself and also just stretching and contracting the target tissue. So in this case, I'm really just putting my arm at an angle where I can stretch the most around my body. And as we discussed in the pull down variations, if this is the line of pull of this machine at this point, right, my forearm stays directly in line with that direction. And again, as far as the cueing perspective goes, in relationship to the first cable variation that I showed, it's all just more of a downward arm motion, and the shoulder blade will follow. So I find that really cueing the shoulder blade forward and across is the most helpful thing on the eccentric or the lengthening portion, right? That portion right there, where you're kind of reaching toward the cable, or you're reaching toward, you know, the cable origin and the machine origin. And then as you contract, as you go through the concentric or the shortening, the most helpful thing is just thinking about dragging your elbow directly downward. In this case, you know, I like to tell people, my clients on this machine, to take their elbow to this pocket, right? So my right pocket is where I'm kind of taking my right elbow. Notice that I don't try to really pull much in any of these variations beyond where my forearm can stay parallel. Again, if you have that rule in your head, if you have that understanding of forearm always stays parallel to the load, then you won't run into those weird arm-based issues. And then this is the last angle I'll show, just again to stay consistent and show some alternative perspectives here. All of the principles in terms of the stretching are the same, and we just want to make sure that as we're pulling, again, we're aiming downward, and the arm path will end up narrow. Again, if you're thinking downward, the arm path will end up narrow if you're achieving that appropriate stretch position. So this is a really cool angle that I like to show whenever teaching, especially on bigger guys that are way bigger than I am, where I'll pull their arm across their body, and all of these sorts of little lines on their shirt will actually kind of smooth out right where that lat really stretches around the body right here. So this is the lat. The most upper fibers of the lat are going to run sort of starting from here across, right? So this whole bulk is the thoracic lat, and they run obviously up and into the bottom of the top of the upper arm. And hopefully this was a helpful perspective to see, just so you can actually see and visualize how narrow my arm path is when I am just cueing elbow down to that pocket. And again, all the principles are the same with all of these different kinds of lat-based motions. You really just want to make sure that on the whole, you're keeping in mind that motion of the shoulder girdle, number one, whether it's more vertical with the vertical variation or more front to back with the horizontal variation. Shoulder blade motion is key, shoulder girdle motion is key, and outside of that, we just want to think about pulling down. Again, I realize that, you know, training single arm may not be as practical for some people. It's potentially more time inefficient. You may end up spending, you know, I typically tend not to spend too much more time doing single arm variations, because I just go back and forth. So my rest for one arm is the rest for the other, as opposed to needing to rest longer for both sides. But it's an individual preference thing, and this happens to be my individual preference. So these two categories of motion, just the stretching the arm across the body, whether it's more overhead or more across the, the front of the body, are going to be the best ways, the most effective ways to actually stretch and potentially shorten the lat as compared to other traditional options like traditional pull downs and traditional rows. I do find that with these exercises there is a little bit of a learning curve, mostly just in regard to the actual force resisting components of it, right? So the actual the stuff I went over a million times with, shoving my arm in this direction, shoving my knee in this direction, or my leg in this direction. But once you have those things down, and once you get a few reps where it just tends to click, it's really, really smooth sailing. And I think all of your lats will really appreciate it and probably get super sore the first time that you do it effectively. So hopefully this sort of analysis was helpful with these visuals and me sort of going over these videos. If you liked it, definitely let me know in the comment section, or if you have any questions about any of this stuff, definitely let me know. And if you're interested in learning more from me, if you want to see more of this kind of content because you're super into it or you get a lot out of it, definitely check the link in the description. That's going to be the link to my online course. I have 15 plus hours of content that's very, very similar to this style of content, except it's going to be more in depth and obviously covering a lot more topics. Everything from the basic physics of exercise down to specific muscle anatomy and joint structure and function and those kinds of things. So hope you all enjoy this. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.